From the shifting shadows of imagination to the blinding light of terror, this is One Tale to Midnight.
The Woodsman of Dead Man's Hollow. The Appalachian Woods in North Carolina are a place of whispered legends and secrets as old as time. Deep in these dense, shadowy forests, among towering oaks and ancient pines, lies Dead Man's Hollow, a place spoken of in hushed voices by the locals, if at all. They call it cursed, haunted by a creature that stalks the unwary. The Woodsman of Dead Man's Hollow, an entity known to some as Bigfoot. But to 16-year-old Tyler, it was nothing more than a ghost story. It was October, and he and his three friends, James, Kenny, and Lisa, were on their annual camping trip. This year, they'd chosen a spot deeper in the forest than ever before, determined to test their courage. They arrived in the late afternoon, just as the last rays of sunlight slanted through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows. The air felt thick with anticipation, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. "Dead Man's Hollow," James announced, spreading his arms wide as they reached the campsite. "Welcome, brave campers, our home for the night." Kenny grinned, though it was a bit forced. "Are you sure we should be here? I mean, I heard there are weird things in these woods." Lisa rolled her eyes. "There's nothing here but us and a bunch of trees. Let's set up camp before it gets dark, all right?" Tyler, ever the leader, nodded. "Let's get the tents up." They pitched their tents, gathered firewood, and soon a crackling fire was warming them against the evening chill. As night fell, the forest transformed. The dense trees loomed taller, darker, and the usual woodland sounds faded, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost watchful. "All right, story time," Tyler said, pulling out a flashlight and holding it under his chin, casting his face in a ghoulish light. "Once, deep in these woods, there was a creature, half man, half monster. He told them about the Woodsman of Dead Man's Hollow, an ancient creature with eyes like glowing embers and a smell like decaying meat. Legend had it that anyone who ventured too deep into his territory was never seen again, their remains scattered in the undergrowth as a warning." "You don't really believe that stuff, do you?" Lisa asked, her voice quivering just slightly. Tyler shrugged. "I don't know. My grandpa told me the story when I was a kid. He swore it was true. Said his friend went camping out here once and never came back." They all chuckled nervously, but the atmosphere had shifted. The shadows around them seemed to pulse, shifting just beyond the firelight. "I think I saw something," Kenny whispered, eyes darting into the darkness. "Oh, come on, Kenny," James scoffed. "It's just a story." But then they heard it, a low, guttural growl rumbling through the trees like distant thunder. It seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath them. All four of them froze, their breath catching in their throats. "What was that?" Lisa whispered, clutching Tyler's arm. Tyler swallowed hard. "Probably just a bear." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Bears didn't make sounds like that. Nothing in the woods did, at least nothing he knew of. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a series of heavy footsteps that shook the ground beneath them. Leaves crunched, and branches snapped as something massive moved through the trees. It's just someone trying to scare us," James said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Another growl, louder this time, and a terrible, acrid stench filled the air, like rotting flesh mixed with wet earth. The smell made Lisa gag, and she clutched her stomach, struggling not to be sick. "Run!" Tyler hissed. "Run!" They bolted, leaving their campsite and belongings behind. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and bending, casting monstrous shadows in the moonlight. Tyler led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. But the beams seemed to do little against the oppressive blackness. Behind them, the footsteps grew louder, the ground trembling with each thudding step. Whatever it was huge and fast. Tyler dared a glance over his shoulder and saw a hulking figure, barely visible in the shadows, but its eyes glowed a sickly, unnatural yellow. Tyler ran harder, his heart pounding in his chest, the taste of fear thick in his throat. Lisa stumbled, crying out as her ankle twisted. Tyler doubled back, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. "Come on, Lisa. We have to keep moving. But it was too late. The creature was upon them. It loomed out of the darkness, towering over them, its matted fur glistening in the moonlight, its mouth twisted in a snarl that revealed rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. Its eyes locked onto Tyler's, and he felt a primal, paralyzing fear seize him. Then it lunged. Tyler shoved Lisa out of the way just as the creature's massive hands swiped through the air where she'd been standing. The beast let out a roar of frustration, and the sound reverberated through the trees, making the very air vibrate. "Run!" Tyler screamed, and they took off again, their only thought to get as far away from the thing as possible. But the creature was relentless, crashing through the forest after them, its breathing heavy and labored, each exhale accompanied by that sickening stench. They stumbled into a clearing, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence. No footsteps, no growls, just the sound of their panicked breathing and the distant hoot of an owl. Did we lose it?" Kenny panted, clutching his side. Tyler shook his head, his eyes scanning the tree line. "I don't know, but we can't stay here. We have to keep moving." But then the growl came again, low and guttural, resonating from the trees around them. It was closer now, impossibly close, as if the creature had somehow circled them, cutting off their escape. "Which way do we go?" Lisa whimpered, clutching Tyler's arm. Before Tyler could answer, the creature stepped into the clearing. In the moonlight, they could see it more clearly now. A massive, ape-like figure covered in thick, matted fur, its face twisted into a grotesque mask of rage. Its eyes burned with a malevolent intelligence, and its mouth curled back in a snarl, revealing teeth sharp enough to tear through flesh. It took a step forward, and they could hear the ground crunching beneath its weight. Tyler's mind raced, searching for a way out, but the creature had them cornered. They were trapped. "Please," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please don't hurt us." But the creature didn't care. It took another step forward, raising one massive hand, claws glinting in the moonlight. Tyler felt a surge of desperation. He picked up a rock and hurled it at the creature. It struck the beast's shoulder, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it let out a deafening roar, its eyes narrowing in anger. "Go!" Tyler shouted, pushing his friends toward the trees. "I'll hold it off." "No!" Lisa cried, grabbing his arm. "We can't leave you." But Tyler shook her off, his face set with grim determination. "Go! Now!" Reluctantly, Lisa and the others turned and ran, disappearing into the trees. Tyler stood his ground, his heart pounding as the creature advanced on him. It was just a few feet away now, its eyes locked onto his, its mouth twisted in a snarl. Tyler felt a surge of defiance, a spark of courage in the face of certain death. If he was going down, he was going down fighting. But just as the creature lunged, a flash of light cut through the darkness, blinding both Tyler and the beast. For a moment, the clearing was filled with a brilliant, searing light, and Tyler heard a voice he recognized. "Tyler, get down!" He dropped to the ground just as a gunshot rang out. The creature let out a roar of pain, stumbling back, its eyes flashing with fury. Tyler looked up to see his grandfather, his face lined with determination, a shotgun in his hands. "Stay back, Tyler. I'll handle this." The creature roared again, but this time there was fear in its eyes. It backed away, snarling, before turning and disappearing into the trees, its footsteps fading into the distance. Tyler stared after it, his heart pounding, barely able to believe what had just happened. His grandfather knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft. "But remember this, Tyler. The woodsman doesn't like trespassers, and he never forgets." In the weeks that followed, Tyler and his friends tried to forget what had happened in Dead Man's Hollow. But the memory lingered, haunting their dreams, a constant reminder of the creature that stalked those dark ancient woods. And though they never spoke of it again, they knew deep down that the woodsman was still out there, watching, waiting, guarding his territory with a vengeance that was as old as the forest itself.
Shadow of the Deep, a cave explorer's tale. Gavin had always been fascinated by caves. Since he was a teenager, he'd been captivated by stories of lost civilizations, subterranean rivers, and eerie creatures rumored to dwell in the darkest parts of the earth. So, when a series of newly discovered caves was found in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, he knew he had to explore them. He prepared meticulously, knowing these caves were deeper and less documented than anything he'd encountered. Gavin packed his gear: high-powered headlamp, backup lights, plenty of food and water, and a small journal to record his findings. What he didn't pack, however, was a weapon. The forests were said to be home to black bears and occasional cougars, but he didn't believe in the wild tales locals told of something more dangerous lurking in those woods. On the first day of his expedition, Gavin felt a strange unease settle over him as he left his truck behind and ventured into the dense forest. Though the trees were vibrant and green, there was a strange heaviness in the air, as if the woods themselves were watching him. The entrance to the cave system was a jagged maw carved into the side of a steep, moss-covered hill. Gavin checked his compass and GPS before stepping inside. The temperature dropped immediately as he descended, and the sounds of the forest faded, replaced by the eerie silence of the cave. For the first few hours, everything was as he'd expected. The tunnels wound deep into the earth, and he marveled at the ancient rock formations. But as he ventured further, he began to notice unusual signs. Footprints, larger than any humans, imprinted in the muddy ground. The hair on the back of his neck prickled, and he instinctively felt he wasn't alone. The footprints seemed fresh, leading deeper into the cave. They were huge, each one measuring nearly 18 inches long and about 8 inches wide. Gavin's rational mind dismissed the idea of Bigfoot. He'd always thought it was a local myth. Yet something about the atmosphere felt different. Something felt wrong. He pressed on, reassuring himself it was just his imagination. But with every step, the sense of being followed grew stronger. Shadows flickered at the edge of his light, and every now and then he thought he heard something, a faint shuffling, the sound of large feet dragging over stone. Hours passed, and Gavin reached a chamber that opened into a massive cavern, one unlike any he'd seen. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like jagged teeth, and an underground river roared through the center, disappearing into the darkness. He marveled at its beauty, setting his camera to capture the cavern's eerie majesty. As he scanned the walls, his eyes settled on something disturbing: scratches, deep, purposeful gouges, as if something had dragged its claws along the rock. They were high up, far out of reach of any bear or cougar. His heart pounded, a growing sense of dread gnawing at him. Suddenly, a guttural growl echoed through the cavern, bouncing off the walls and amplifying until it seemed to come from every direction. Gavin's headlamp flickered, and he cursed, smacking the light until it steadied. When it did, he saw something moving at the edge of his vision, a massive, shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. He froze, heart pounding. The figure was enormous, its silhouette towering well over 7 feet. It was covered in matted fur, and its eyes glinted in the darkness, reflecting the light like an animal's. Gavin's stomach churned as the creature took a step toward him, muscles rippling under its shaggy coat. He felt a primal terror, the kind that reminded him of mankind's deepest fears of the dark. Without thinking, he turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the tunnels as he retraced his steps. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear it following, the sound of heavy feet pounding against the stone floor, coming closer with each second. Gavin stumbled, catching himself against a rock, and scrambled to regain his balance. His headlamp flickered again, and he cursed as the beam weakened. Desperately, he fumbled for his backup flashlight and turned it on, aiming it down the passageway he'd come from. There it was, closer now, moving with surprising agility for something so massive. Gavin's breath hitched as he caught a clear glimpse of the creature. It had the unmistakable face of an ape, but there was something almost human in its eyes: intelligence, awareness, and something dark, something filled with hunger. He turned and kept running, his lungs burning as he pushed himself harder than he ever had. He could hear the creature gaining, its growls echoing off the cave walls, the sound growing louder, closer. After what felt like an eternity, he reached a narrow tunnel and squeezed himself through, hoping the creature wouldn't fit. He listened, heart hammering, but the growls faded, replaced by silence. He exhaled, allowing himself a moment of relief. But he knew he couldn't stay here. He needed to find another way out, fast. Gavin crept along the passage, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was still following him, lurking just out of sight. He didn't dare turn off his flashlight, even though the batteries were starting to wane. The idea of being trapped in the dark with that creature was unbearable. The tunnel eventually opened into a smaller chamber. Gavin took a moment to catch his breath, leaning against the cool stone wall. His hands shook as he took out his water bottle, gulping down the cool liquid. As he lowered the bottle, his eyes drifted to the ground, and he froze. There, in the mud, was a fresh footprint, and it was facing him. The growl echoed once more, louder this time, reverberating through the chamber. Gavin's head snapped up, and his flashlight caught the glint of eyeshine just a few yards away. The creature had somehow circled around, cutting off his escape. He staggered back, heart pounding in his chest as he realized there was no way out. Gavin's mind raced, searching for options. His gear was limited: flashlights, a camera, a utility knife, and a climbing rope. He'd faced danger in caves before, but nothing like this. The creature took a step forward, and he could see its massive hands, each finger tipped with claws that looked capable of shredding rock. In a moment of desperation, Gavin grabbed a handful of loose rocks and hurled them at the creature. They bounced off its thick fur harmlessly, but it hesitated, cocking its head as if surprised. He took the opportunity to dash to the side, slipping through another narrow tunnel just as the creature lunged for him, its claws scraping against the walls with a sickening screech. He ran blindly, stumbling through the darkness, his flashlight barely illuminating the twists and turns of the cave. He could hear the creature behind him, its growls growing louder, more frustrated. He knew he couldn't outrun it forever, and his chances of finding the original exit were slim. Just when he thought he'd reached a dead end, Gavin's flashlight caught a glimmer of light up ahead, a small crack in the wall, through which daylight was streaming. He scrambled toward it, wedging himself into the gap and forcing his way through. The opening was tight, but he managed to squeeze his way out, emerging into the blinding light of day. He tumbled onto the forest floor, gasping for breath. The silence of the forest was a stark contrast to the chaos inside the cave, and for a moment he lay there, stunned. But his relief was short-lived. As he glanced back at the cave entrance, he saw the shadow of the creature lingering just inside, its glowing eyes watching him. Gavin stumbled to his feet and backed away, never taking his eyes off the cave. The creature didn't follow him, but he could feel its gaze, a dark promise lingering in the air. He turned and ran, not stopping until he reached his truck. As he drove away, he glanced back at the forest, shivering as he remembered the creature's eyes. He knew he would never return to those caves, the mystery, the thrill. It wasn't worth what he'd seen, what had almost taken him. Gavin never told anyone about his encounter. Some things, he decided, were better left buried deep in the darkness.
The Hunt in Black Pine Forest. It was late October of 1982, and Jimmy Ray Tyler was preparing for a hunt in Black Pine Forest, a stretch of isolated, thickly wooded terrain in the backcountry of Idaho. Jimmy was no novice. He'd been hunting since he was 10. He'd grown up hearing his granddad's tales of strange creatures that lived in the forest, and though he respected nature's mysteries, he had little belief in tales of monsters. Jimmy's destination was a small rustic cabin he'd inherited from his granddad, perched in a secluded part of the forest. No one had used it in years, and it was miles away from the nearest town, a perfect spot for peace, isolation, and hunting. The locals, especially the old-timers, had warned Jimmy about Black Pine Forest. They told stories of men who'd gone in and never come out, of strange noises echoing through the trees, of something else that roamed the woods. Jimmy, that forest's cursed, warned old Earl Stokes, a longtime resident of the nearby town. Folks talk about seeing something big, hairy, not natural, not an animal like you'd know. Jimmy laughed it off, tipping his hat at the old man. I think I'll be fine, Earl. Been hunting these woods since I was a kid. As Jimmy drove his old pickup toward the forest, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. The road narrowed, twisting and turning as he ventured deeper. The trees seemed to loom larger, casting long shadows in the fading daylight. As he neared the cabin, the silence felt heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath. He arrived just as the sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in ominous shades of red and purple. Jimmy grabbed his gear, checked his rifle, and went inside. The cabin was dusty, and the air was stale, but it would do. He quickly set about lighting a fire in the old stone hearth, trying to bring some warmth to the cold, silent space. As he settled in, Jimmy thought back to a story his granddad had told him when he was young. His granddad had spoken of a creature, a towering, hairy beast that walked like a man, but with the power of a bear. It lurked in these very woods, waiting, watching. Jimmy had brushed it off as nothing more than an old man's tale. But tonight, alone in the cabin, the story came creeping back, lingering in the corners of his mind. At dawn, Jimmy was up, rifle in hand, and ready for the hunt. The air was thick with the earthy smell of pine and damp leaves, and a thick fog blanketed the forest floor. As he ventured deeper into the woods, a strange silence accompanied him. There was no birdsong, no rustling of small animals. Jimmy tracked a set of fresh deer tracks for nearly an hour before he heard something rustle behind him. He turned sharply, rifle at the ready, but saw only trees swaying in the wind. He shook his head, telling himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks. As he continued, Jimmy felt a sudden chill run down his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. It was as if he were being watched, hunted. He scanned the area, seeing nothing but towering pines and dense underbrush. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A massive, shadowy figure stood 100 yards away, half hidden among the trees. At first, Jimmy thought it was a bear, but as he squinted, he saw it was too tall, too upright. It had a hunched posture, thick fur that seemed almost matted with mud, and piercing eyes that seemed to glow in the shadowed forest. The creature turned and vanished into the trees before Jimmy could raise his rifle. His heart hammered in his chest and a chill crept down his spine. Was that a man? An animal? Or something else entirely? Jimmy was no fool. He decided to head back to the cabin and rethink his plans. He made his way back cautiously, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. The woods were unnervingly quiet, the air thick with tension. When he finally reached the cabin, he locked the door and sat by the fire, trying to shake the unease that gnawed at him. He told himself it was probably a trick of the light, a bear standing upright to get a better look, maybe even a shadow playing tricks on his eyes. That night, Jimmy lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin. His granddad's stories played over in his mind, and every sound seemed to fuel his growing fear. The following morning, Jimmy resolved to put his fear behind him. He loaded his rifle and set out once more. The fog had lifted, but the air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. As he walked, he began noticing strange things: twisted branches, claw marks on trees, and enormous footprints pressed deep into the damp earth. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen. They were nearly twice the size of his boot, with a distinct pattern that suggested something both human and animal. His pulse quickened as he followed the tracks. Each step took him deeper into the heart of the forest, into an area that felt untouched, ancient. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a dark canopy that blocked out the sunlight. The air was cold and smelled of decay. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled through the forest, sending a jolt of fear through Jimmy's body. He froze, clutching his rifle, straining his ears to pinpoint the source. The growl came again, closer this time, a deep, guttural sound that made his skin crawl. Jimmy slowly turned, and there it was, standing about 50 yards away. The creature was massive, towering at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, piercing through the shadows. Its face was a twisted combination of man and beast, with a snout like a wolf's, but with human-like eyes filled with malice. It bared sharp, jagged teeth, and its hands, if they could be called hands, ended in long, claw-like fingers. Jimmy's instinct was to run, but he knew better. He aimed his rifle at the creature, hands trembling. He squeezed the trigger, the gunshot echoing through the forest. The creature barely flinched. It tilted its head, almost as if amused, before letting out a bone-chilling howl that reverberated through the trees. Then it started toward him, each step slow, deliberate. Jimmy fired again, but it was no use. The creature kept coming, its eyes locked on him. Panic surged through him, and he turned, sprinting back toward the cabin, the creature's heavy footsteps pounding behind him. He could hear it breathing, a raspy, monstrous sound that seemed to grow closer with every step. Jimmy's lungs burned as he pushed himself to run faster, the branches clawing at his face and arms. He burst into the clearing and dove into the cabin, slamming the door behind him. He locked it and pressed his back against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a heavy thud shook the cabin as the creature rammed into the door. The walls trembled, dust falling from the ceiling. Jimmy backed away, clutching his rifle, knowing it was useless. The creature let out a low growl, followed by a scraping sound as it clawed at the door. Jimmy could hear the wood splintering, could feel the door starting to give. He backed into the corner of the cabin, his heart pounding as he realized he had no way out. The creature's claws finally broke through the door, and it peered inside, its yellow eyes scanning the room. It let out a snarl and pushed its way in, ducking under the low doorway. Jimmy raised his rifle, fired one last desperate shot, but it had no effect. The creature lunged at him, and Jimmy felt a searing pain as its claws tore into his flesh. He screamed, struggling against its iron grip, but it was no use. The creature lifted him effortlessly, its face mere inches from his. And for a brief, terrifying moment, he saw something in its eyes, a flicker of intelligence, of malevolence. Then everything went black. Days later, a search party ventured into Black Pine Forest, looking for Jimmy. They found his cabin, door torn off its hinges, the inside smeared with blood. His rifle lay on the floor, bent and broken. They searched the forest, combing every inch, but there was no sign of Jimmy. All they found were massive footprints leading deep into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. To this day, the locals speak in hushed tones of Jimmy Ray Tyler and the creature that roams Black Pine Forest. Some say it was a bear, others say it was something else, something ancient, something that doesn't belong in this world. And on quiet nights when the wind is still, you can sometimes hear a low, guttural growl echoing through the trees, a reminder that the forest holds its secrets close and doesn't take kindly to those who trespass.
Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe, because I have more tales to tell.